Hello, everyone. This is the Kingdom Channel. And last time we talked about Psalm 22 and some of the translational dispute about verse 16. Now, if you haven't watched that one, I would encourage you to go watch it, but you don't absolutely need to watch it for this one. In this one, we're going to be still talking about Psalm 22, and we're going to be talking about some of the claims against Psalm 22 being about Jesus. So, if the Jewish community denies that Psalm 22 is talking about Jesus as the Messiah, they must claim that it's talking about someone. So the next reason they give to deny Jesus's messiahship in Psalm 22 is that they claim that Psalm 22 is David talking about himself.
The opening of Psalm 22 opens with the cry of dereliction. It's quoted in the book of Mark. Eli, Eli, lama azavtoni. And that's picked up in Mark. Now, King David is speaking about himself, but Mark then puts those words into the mouth of Jesus in his version of Jesus's cry of dereliction in his passion narrative.
So let's put this claim to the test and see if David truly fits Psalm 22. Let's start by looking at verse 1. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my salvation are the words of my groaning." So the first thing that is required of this person in Psalm 22 is that they have to be forsaken by God. So let's see, is David forsaken? And maybe you're thinking that he's simply talking about his circumstances, that he feels like he's been forsaken by God. But if David were to really be forsaken by God, that would actually be contrary to what Scripture says and even what David says himself. Because circumstances do not dictate that God has forsaken anyone. If you even look at the next Psalm, Psalm 23, this is what it says. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Certainly, he's not talking about, oh, it's dark outside and there's shadows. No, he's talking about circumstances. These are dire circumstances, yet David affirms that God is with him. Now, another question might come up. Well, what if David was in sin and that's why God forsook him? Well, another requirement of this passage is that this person, while being forsaken, must also be trusting in God. So, if you read it, verses 3 through 5 and 9 through 10, it is very clear that this forsaking that is happening is not because he is in sin. It says this, "Yet you are holy, enthroned upon the praises of Israel, and you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you rescued them. To you they cried out and were granted escape. And you they trusted and were not disappointed. Yet you are he who brought me out of the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb." So as this person is being forsaken, he is giving exaltation to God. And if you remember that even when David sinned with Bathsheba, when he committed adultery and murder, God did not forsake David. And if you remember, one of the promises of God to the Israelites was that he would never leave them nor forsake them. And really the only time when it talks about being forsaken, it's when Israel forsakes God, not when God forsakes Israel. And maybe there's, again, another thought that maybe it's that David was being disciplined. But even in the midst of discipline, God does not forsake his people. The next thing that is required is that after this person is forsaken by God, God hears him and helps him. And this comes from verses 19 through 21, where it says, "But you, O Yahweh, be not far off, O my strength. Hasten to my help. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion and from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me." And then we see in verse 24 that it's kind of switched on how they're looking at this servant. It says, "For he has not despised, and he has not abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but when he cried to him for help, he heard." So we see that in some way, even though God forsook him, he was not left forsaken. Is that there's something that happened after God forsook this man in Psalm 22, that he was brought out of the power of the dog, and that he was delivered, and that when he cried to him for help, he heard. So I think I'll just go through the rest of the requirements. So if you look in verse 27, it says, "All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to Yahweh, and all the families of the nations will worship before you." So another requirement of this man in Psalm 22 is that he brings about the worship of the nations. That's including all the earth. That means the Gentile nations as well. Another requirement is found in verse 29. "All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship, and all those who go down to the dust will bow before him." Now, some might argue that's talking about Yahweh. I think that the subject of this whole psalm is this figure from the beginning who was pierced, who was forsaken. But so that's another requirement, is that all who go down to the dust, meaning die, worship or bow before him in one way or another. And then lastly, in verse 31, this is honestly the kicker. "Because of this man, they will come and declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has done it." So a generation not seen will worship him, will worship God. So let's recap the three requirements. First, he will cause all the ends of the earth, meaning the Gentiles, to worship Yahweh. Second is that those who die will bow before him. And third, it's that a generation yet to come, meaning after when this is written, will worship God because of him. So does David fit these three? Will he cause all the ends of the earth to worship God, including the Gentiles? I mean, in David's time, the Gentiles were still excluded from worship. Until his death, they were excluded from worshiping God. I think number two just really puts it like there's just no way it's David. The dead will bow down to him and worship him. No. Yeah, that's not David. And then really, even as David is writing this, he's talking about future generations declaring of his righteousness, that he has done it. So I think even just contextually, it looks like David is not talking about himself in any manner. The question still remains then, who is this talking about? Who fulfills Psalm 22? Is it Muhammad? No. Maybe it's one of the Jewish rabbis of the last 2,000 years. Maybe Rambam. Well, no. It's hard to think of someone. Oh, well, you know what? I actually do know of someone who has been forsaken of God. I know of someone who is considered a worm and not a man. I know of someone who is a reproach of men and despised by people. I know of someone who has said to him, "Commit yourself to Yahweh. Let him rescue him." I know of someone who was poured out like water, and all of his bones were out of joint, and his heart was like wax, and it was melted within him. I know of someone whose feet and hands were pierced. And I know of someone who was forsaken of God, who died, and who rose again. I know of someone if you seek him, you will praise Yahweh forever. I know of someone whom all the ends of the earth, the Gentiles and the Jews alike, because of him, they worship him. They worship God. And I know of someone whom every tongue will confess as Lord, and every knee will bow before him. And I can declare his righteousness now, and I can say that Jesus has done it. Thanks for watching. And if you're still interested in the subject of Psalm 22, I will be making one more. But until then, keep advancing the kingdom of Christ and pushing back the dominion of darkness.